Possible 15-point question. How far was overproduction the main cause of the Great Depression in the USA? For many, the 1920s was a period of prosperity, with Ford's car industry at the centre of the American economy, employing millions of people. However, in October 1929, this prosperity ended and marked the beginning of the Depression, triggered by the Wall Street crash. Essentially, we need to be thinking about the question, why did the USA fall into depression? Firstly, there is the key issue of overproduction. Those people who could afford consumer goods had already bought them through the use of credit. This meant that in many cases, businesses had made too many goods. Normally, businesses would try and sell goods abroad, but the USA's tariff policy had put a tax on all foreign goods in order to be able to sell their own at home. Consequently, other countries put a tax on American goods, making them far too expensive to sell abroad, and companies were stuck with the goods that they could not sell. It must be remembered at this point that many Americans were actually living in poverty. Another reason to explain why the USA fell into depression was through the buying and selling of shares. Most of the 1920s saw share prices rise, and therefore people were able to make lots of money when they sold them on. People bought shares by something called borrowing on the margin. This meant that people put down 10% of what they wanted to borrow as a deposit and bought shares with the rest. An example being able to borrow $1,000 with only $100 as a deposit. However, overproduction and America's tariff policy meant that people began to panic and share prices began to dramatically drop. Eventually, shares became practically worthless and businesses were no longer making any profit. This drop in value is known in economics as a crash, hence the Wall Street crash. Ordinary of millions of Americans became bankrupt. Those people who had borrowed on the margin could not afford to pay the money back. Homes were repossessed by the banks and millions of people were made unemployed. Overall, and in summary, it is clear that the overproduction of goods did play an important role in explaining why there was a depression. However, other factors such as the tariff policy, millions of people already living in poverty, and millions who had borrowed thousands of dollars meant that when the value of shares crashed on the Wall Street Stock Exchange, depression set in that would last until the onset of World War II.